Nika from Made to Sew. In this class, we're going to be looking at how to work with a splittable double-faced wool fabric. We're going to look at how to sew seams, finish the edges, and sew darts in this material so that you could create an unlined coat or jacket. This is class 1 of a 3-part series where I'm going to be showing you how to draft and sew this coat. In this class, we're going to be simply looking at techniques for sewing a double cloth or double-faced splittable fabric. So what is a splittable wool fabric? Often called a double-faced fabric or a double cloth fabric. A splittable wool fabric is 2 layers of material that have been constructed together with tiny threads. This allows you to unfasten the threads between the 2 layers in order to finish seams and edges of the material. So let's get started with some techniques. For the first part of this tutorial, we're going to look at how to finish the edges of the double layered cloth. Now you're going to need to finish edges if you're making something like a coat at the front edge, the hem, the collar and the lapel. We're going to start by completing a basting stitch, which becomes a bit of a guideline for us and controls the seam that we're going to be sewing. I recommend using a colour thread that will stand out for your basting stitch. Usually I would complete a basting stitch at double the distance of my seam allowance. My seam allowance is 1/4 inch on this project, so my basting stitch is going to be 1/2 inch away from the edge. If you're working with metric, I would recommend a seam allowance of 5 mm and a basting stitch of 1 cm. Set up your sewing machine for a straight stitch and increase the stitch length to a basting stitch. This is a stitch length that's greater than 4 mm. Start the basting stitch with a singular back stitch and then sew along the length of the material. If you're working with a corner, such as the collar or a lapel, insert the needle, raise the presser foot and turn the corner. Finish with a singular back stitch. Once you've completed your basting stitch, you're going to want to separate the 2 layers of fabric from each other from the edge of the material up to the basting stitch. Use a small pair of scissors or a pair of snips to make this easy. Once you get started, it's usually pretty easy to see the threads that you need to cut between the 2 layers of fabric. You can gently pull the layers of fabric apart, but you do want to be careful that you don't distort the material. Separate the material up until you can see the basting stitch. Make sure that you don't cut through the basting stitch. Once you've separated the 2 layers of material, it's usually a good idea to give them an iron just to remove any distortion that may have occurred. You can iron them separately, like I'm doing here, or together. The next step is to complete your guide stitch. This stitch needs to be completed in the same colour thread as your fabric. Now the guide stitch needs to be completed on the actual stitching line of your garment on both layers of the fabric that you've separated. The seam allowance for my garment is 1/4 inch, or if you're working with metric, you could use 5 mm. The guide stitch is a straight stitch with a normal stitch length of 2.5 mm. You can start and end with a back stitch. Sew along the fabric following your seam allowance. If you're working with a corner, you will turn the corner in the same way that you did with the basting stitch. You will need to complete this for both layers of your fabric. Once you've completed the guideline of stitching on your stitching line, you're then going to need to trim your seam allowance slightly. Usually you want to remove approximately 1/8 inch, so 2 to 3 mm. And you can do this from both layers at the same time, or you can work to trim the individual layers separately. If you're working with a really thick fabric, you may wish to trim a little bit more. Now what we're going to do is fold the material on that stitching line towards the center of the seam, and you'll do that on both sides. So the material is going inwards and we're going to be hand stitching this outer edge. Of course, I would usually use a thread that matched my material. I'm going to use a dark thread so that I can show you the stitch we're doing. Tie a knot at the end of your thread and take it through one of the separated layers, from the wrong side to the right side. Sew over yourself a couple of times to anchor the stitch, working in the seam allowance between the guide stitch line and the raw edge of the material. Then we're going to start the ladder stitch. So what you want to do here is you want to work from side to side, completing what I like to call a ladder stitch. So where my thread is coming out of the fabric, I'm going to go directly opposite, horizontally, and I'm going to go in and out of the other folded edge of the fabric. And this can be for a generous 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters or so. And then I would do the same again. Horizontally, I'm working across to the other folded seam allowance. I want to go in and out of this fabric, and you should be working your in and out of the fabric either on the stitching line, your guide stitching line that you folded the fabric along, or just beyond that, ever so slightly, the width of the needle beyond that towards the basting stitch. And as you start to pull the stitches relatively tightly, you should find that they disappear into the material, especially if you're working with a thread that matches your material. Make sure that you don't pull your stitches so tight that you start to pull the fabric or gather up the fabric. When you get close to the corner here, all you need to do is to work around the corner in the same way. You've got the seam allowances on the one side folding in one direction. You will then fold the seam allowances on the other side into the middle in the other direction. If your fabric is bulky, you can fold the seam allowances in opposite directions. I generally put a stitch or two in the very corner to secure that area. And then you would continue as you did before. When you get to the end of the thread, you will need to sew over yourself inside the seam allowance or knot it, and then start again. Finalize your seam by removing the basting stitch. You can use a small pair of snips or an unpicker. If you're left with any stray threads, use a pair of tweezers to remove them. Then the final step would be to give your finished seam a press. If you find that your hand stitching has curled up or gathered your seam slightly because you've pulled your stitches a little bit too tight, you can usually get rid of this with ironing, especially if you're working with a natural material such as wool. Test a sample of your material first and find the right settings for your material. For my material, I found that ironing it without steam was no problem. When using steam, I needed to raise the iron and steam onto the fabric from a distance. And there you have the seam that can be used to finish the outside edges of a double-faced or double cloth material. The next technique that we're going to look at is how to sew a seam in the double layered fabric. Now for a seam, we're going to treat each side of the seam slightly differently. So you will need to decide beforehand which direction you want your seam allowances to be pressed when this seam is finished. Most of the time, you're going to be pressing them or finishing them towards the back of the garment. For this example, I'm going to be sending my seam allowances towards the left. If you would prefer to send your seam allowances towards the right, you will need to do the opposite of what I suggest. We will start by doing a basting stitch, which is going to be a guide stitch for us to open up and separate the layers of material. We only need to do this on the side of the fabric that's going to be accepting the seam. So for this example, it's going to be the left side because my seam allowance will be sent towards the left. Complete a basting stitch, which is a stitch length of 4 millimeters or greater, and sew this a distance of double the seam allowance. My seam allowance is 1/4 inch, so I will be sewing my basting stitch 1/2 inch away from the edge of the material. If you're working in metric, I would recommend 5 millimeter seam allowance and a 1 centimeter distance for your basting stitch. This basting stitch will be removed from the garment once complete, so it can be sewn in a contrasting colour. Once the basting stitch is complete, you will need to use a pair of snips or small scissors to separate the two layers of fabric from the edge of the fabric right up to the basting stitch. Just make sure that you don't cut through the basting stitch. On completion, it's a good idea to press the seam allowances because they can become a little bit distorted. Test the iron on your material first and be cautious if your material has a nap. Before we join these two pieces of material together to create a seam, we're going to need to complete a guide stitch. The guide stitch should be completed on the side of the separated seam allowances that's going to be at the back of the garment or the inside of the garment when finished. The guide stitch is a standard 2.5 millimeter straight stitch that needs to be completed in the same colour as your material. So following the seam allowance that you have planned for this project, I'm working with 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters. Backstitch at the start and end. Now we can sew the two pieces of material together. We have one piece with a basting stitch and a guide stitch on one side, and another piece that has no stitches. Place the right sides of the material together. You need to be attaching the one side of the material that doesn't have a basting or a guide stitch on it to the top layer of the separated seam allowance of the fabric. This is the separated piece of the fabric that's going to be at the front of the garment or project when finished. You will need to ensure that the bottom layer of the seam allowance is kept out of the way whilst sewing. This is the seam allowance with the guide stitch on it. At the machine, you will be sewing a normal straight stitch with a 2.5mm stitch length, following your seam allowance. Mine is 1/4 inch or 5mm. Backstitch to secure at the start and end of the seam. Once the two pieces of material have been sewn together, you will probably need to do some trimming. Trim the seam allowance of the seam that you've just sewn, joining the two pieces of fabric together. Remove approximately 1/8 to 1/16 of an inch, 2 to 3mm. You will also need to trim a small amount from the seam allowance where the guide stitching is. Again, 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3mm. If you have very thick fabric, you may need to trim a little bit more. Press the seam allowances in position towards the basting stitch. Then you can turn your work to the wrong side so that we can finish this seam by completing some hand stitching. You're going to want to fold under the free seam allowance on the guideline that you previously stitched at the sewing machine, tucking the extra seam allowance towards the inside. You will want to use a thread that matches the colour of your material. I'm working with a contrasting colour for this tutorial. Start with a little knot at the end of your thread and sew over yourself a couple of times in the seam allowance. You will then work along the seam, completing a slip stitch. The slip stitch will look something like this and is ideally as invisible as possible. Bring the needle out on the folded edge of the free seam allowance. The needle should come out on either the stitching line or a needle's distance past the stitching line closer to the basting stitch. Then take your needle directly opposite, parallel to where the thread has come out of the folded edge, and place the needle back into the fabric, going into the stitching line that joined the two pieces of material together, or a needle's width past this, away from the basting stitch. Take the needle on an angle through the material, making sure that it doesn't come through to the right side of the fabric, and bring it out again on the folded edge of the free seam allowance. The stitch length should be approximately 1/4 inch to 5mm, but work with your fabric and what works best for you to make this a really invisible stitch. This is why this is the inside of the garment, because it won't be quite as perfect as the machine sewn stitch for the outside of the garment. Continue sewing this stitch all the way along the length of the seam and secure by sewing over yourself and or knotting your thread when needed. Once the stitch has been hand sewn and is finished, you can then remove your basting stitch. Remove this with an unpicker or a small pair of snips, whatever works best for you. And finally, give everything a nice press. As we discussed a few times, you do want to be cautious with your iron to make sure that your iron doesn't damage your material, especially if you have a nap. And there we have it. This is a seam in the double layered material. Now I want to talk to you about what would happen if you have another seam that's going to be joining this. So we're now going to attach another piece of material to the bottom of this seam. Now for the joining piece of material, I've prepared things in the same way that you would have prepared the side that was accepting the seam in the previous seam construction. I sewed my basting stitch at 1/2 inch, separated the two layers of material, and completed a guide stitch at my stitching line, 1/4 inch, on what will be the inside of the garment. I will then place the right sides of the material together, pinning the joining piece to what is the top layer of the separated seam allowance, and sew them together along the 1/4 inch stitching line. I would finish this by trimming and pressing just like we did with the seam construction, and finishing with the hand sewn slip stitch on the inside. Finish by removing your basting stitch and pressing your material. And you're left with something that looks like this. A nice and neat seam join. We also need to talk about seams where you've got a seam in your material, but you also need to be finishing the bottom or top edge of that seam like you would for the outside edge of a garment. This might occur on something like a belt, which is what you see here, or perhaps the side seam where you're going to need to be finishing the hem of the garment in this manner. For this seam technique, you will complete some of the steps as normal. The side that's going to be receiving the seam will require the basting stitch, as completed for the other seams. The material will be separated up to the basting stitch, and on the wrong side you will complete the guide stitch as normal. The different step is when it comes to sewing the two pieces together, placing the right sides of the material together and sewing the one side to the top separated seam allowance. Rather than sewing all the way through from the top to the bottom edge of the material, you won't sew through the edges of the material that you're planning to finish. So if this was a belt, I would start 1/2 inch or whatever distance my basting stitch is from the edges and stop the same distance away from the edges. For something like a side seam, you would be able to start at the top edge under the arm, but you would need to stop that 1/2 inch distance from the bottom edge so that you have the ability to finish the hem. This will allow you to easily separate those seam allowances and finish them along the edges. As completed with the other standard seams, you would then trim your seam allowances and press as required. Then you're going to complete your hand-sewn slip stitch. It's important here that you complete your slip stitch starting and stopping along the same points as your machine sewn stitch, keeping the space for you to finish the seam allowances at the edges. Remove the basting thread from this section before you move on to the next step. So as you can see by this example, I've completed my slip stitch for the seam here, and then I took my work back to the sewing machine and I completed my basting stitch all the way around. This is an example for perhaps a belt of a coat. If you were working with something like the side seam, then you may have already done your basting stitch everywhere, in which case it's not too much of an issue. But it can be a good idea to leave the basting stitch, at least for a small area, at the bottom of seams if you need to be finishing them in this way, because it ensures that the seam allowance is completely even all the way across the seam. The next step would be to separate the layers of material, and you would do that on all of the seams that you needed to finish, and complete your guide stitch, which is sewn on the stitching line, 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters for my example. You do need to be cautious when completing your guide stitch over the seam join, because the material of the two sides will not be connected at this point. Just make sure that the layers of fabric are sitting as they should as you sew over them. You may need to force them a little bit at the machine. Or you can hand sew the two layers of separated seam allowance together prior to taking it to the sewing machine. This can be useful on trickier seams. Then you would be ready to trim, like I've done here, and complete the hand sewing just like you did for finishing the edges of the material, a ladder stitch. The only difference over this seam is that it's a little bit bulky, and you may find that you need to add stitches a little bit closer together. And you'll be left with something like so. The stitches on the edge over the thicker seam join can be a little bit more visible than they might be on the rest of the seam. But as long as you're working with a thread that's in the same colour as your material, you shouldn't have an issue seeing them. You would of course finish this with the same steps that we've taken with all of the other seams, removing the basting stitch and pressing. Now, to finish this tutorial, we're going to look at how you would sew a dart in the double layered fabric. Now, it's generally a good idea to mark your dart stitching line onto the wrong side of your material. Your dart will have the same seam allowance. In my case, it's 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters. And you can remove the bulk from the center of the dart during the cutting out stage, because we won't be leaving that in the dart. As with the other techniques, the first step is to complete our basting stitch, a straight stitch with a length greater than 4 millimeters. This needs to be completed on one side of the dart at a distance of 1/2 inch away from the edge of the material, or 1/4 inch away from the stitching line of the dart. It can be useful to draw this on with some chalk to ensure that you're accurate. Now, it's important that you place your basting stitch on the side of the dart that you want your seam allowances to be pressed towards. With a dart, you're usually going to be pressing the seam allowances down towards the hem of the garment or towards the center. Complete your basting stitch from the edge of the dart all the way to and past the dart point. Once complete, you can then start to separate the layers of the material. You're going to want to separate the layers of the material right up to the basting stitch on the side of the dart that is closest to the basting stitch. You will need to separate the 2 layers of fabric up to and through the point of the dart, focusing on the side of the dart that's closest to the basting stitch. In order to get to the point, you will need to clip into the center of the dart, but you should only be doing this on the wrong side of the material, separating the 2 layers of material as you work. Press the seam allowances to remove any distortion. Once you've separated the material far enough, you can then complete your guide stitch. Now, the guide stitch needs to take place on what will be the inside of the garment, on the side of the dart where the basting stitch is. You should be completing your guide stitch on the dart stitching line. This would be 1/4 inch, 5 millimeters away from the edge of the material, but it's usually easier to sew directly on the dart stitching line, and you can draw this onto your material. Back stitch at the start and end. Once the guide stitch has been sewn, you're then going to want to sew the dart. To do that, you'll fold back this seam allowance that's going to be at the back of the garment, and you will be sewing the right sides together. This is the right side, matching the edges and sewing on that 1/4 inch, 5 millimeter seam allowance, or of course you can draw on your stitching line for the dart. You need to be sewing all the way through to the dart point, keeping this seam allowance back out of the way. And you're sewing this just like you would any other dart, along the stitching line from the outside edge to the point, sewing off the material at the point with a small back stitch. The most important thing is to keep that free layer of separated seam allowance out of the way whilst you're sewing, so that you don't accidentally catch it. Now, here we have our dart from the front of the material and from the back of the material, with this seam allowance or separated layer of material completely free. The next step is, as we've completed with every other seam, to press your seam allowances towards the basting stitch. Use a pressing ham if required, and to trim both the seam allowances that have all been sewn together, as well as the seam allowance that belongs to the guide stitch. To finish the inside of the dart, you're going to use exactly the same technique as what you use to finish the inside of a normal seam. Fold under the inside seam allowance along the stitching line and complete a hand-sewn slip stitch. I would start at the wide edge of the dart and sew towards the point. The first part of this technique will be exactly the same as any of the other seams that you've sewn with a slip stitch. As you near the point of the dart, it can get a little bit trickier, and you're simply going to want to work with smaller stitches, working all the way to and past the point of the dart to secure the inside of the material. Finish the stitch by sewing over yourself a couple of times or tying a knot. Finish by removing the basting stitch. Finalize your dart with a nice press. And there you have it. This is a dart sewn in a double layered fabric, from the front and from the wrong side. Thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this class and that you learned some new techniques. If you're interested in continuing with the series, you can join me in the next class for pattern drafting the coat and then finally sewing the coat.